All right, once again, it's good to see everybody here. If you want to turn to, excuse me, I turn to Mark chapter 14. We'll be picking up there in Mark chapter 14, and we'll be in verse 26. Now, what we're dealing with here in the Gospel of Mark is really the last final moments of Christ before his crucifixion. And we're getting down to really just a few hours before he will be tried and put to death. And in Mark chapter 14, what we find is the disciples being there with Jesus in those final hours. And in chapter 14, at the beginning of the chapter, we found that the disciples were there in Bethany, right, with Simon the leper, his house, and they were there, and this woman came and broke her alabaster vial of pure nard on him and anointed him in devotion and commitment and love. And then we see the disciples in the upper room where they're feasting with Christ, they're conversing with Christ. Christ is teaching them various things. And then today we're going to see Christ at the Mount of Olives, and then more specifically in Gethsemane, the place of sorrow, agony, and distress. And I would submit to you before we get into that section that in our walk, in our spiritual walk before the Lord, we're going to find ourselves in those three places. When we first come to the Lord, we come to him as though in Bethany. We come to him pouring out our lives before him in love and devotion and in commitment, saying, Lord, even my most precious things I break before you, and I pour out my life to you and commit myself to you, God, in devotion. And we come to Christ in love and adoration. And then that transfers into feasting and fellowshipping with Christ, learning from his teachings and taking in his word and being strengthened by what he can teach us, and just being there in close connection to Christ and communion with him as the disciples in the upper room. And we get to experience what the Apostle John got to experience, being close to his breast, close to his chest, there reclining at the table with him. And it's a beautiful thing to be able to walk in closeness to the Lord, nearness to him, and just taking in his presence. But if we live long enough, and most of us will, we're also going to have to follow Christ to Gethsemane. As beautiful as Bethany is, and as wonderful as that is, the passion, the love, the devotion of Bethany, and however wonderful it is to feast with Christ, to commune with Christ, to learn from Christ, as beautiful as that is and wonderful as that is, we always have in our knowledge that Gethsemane is coming. At some point in our walk with the Lord, we got to go with him to the garden, where perhaps the joy of being a Christian, the love, the overflow of joy that we have might seem just a flickering light, just a distant memory to our souls. The disciples, yes, got to enjoy him in Bethany. They got to enjoy him in the upper room. But now it's time to go with him to Gethsemane. And this is a time when a lot of Christians want to check out, right? I want the Jesus of Bethany. I want the Jesus of the upper room. But boy, don't ask me to go into the garden with him. Don't ask me to go to the Mount of Olives. Don't ask me to go where there is distress, where there's darkness. That's not what I signed up for, we might say. Well, this is where we find him. And in verse 26, this is where the scene begins. Again, this is Mark 14 and verse 26. It says, after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. A very straightforward verse, very straightforward statement. But when you think about and reflect on what hymn they would have sung at this point, we can see that it would be very appropriate that they were singing this hymn. What song were they singing? Amazing Grace? Well, Amazing Grace hadn't been invented yet, hadn't been written yet. No, a Jewish person back then, when they were sitting down for the Passover meal, what they would have sung is Psalm 113 through 118, and most likely selective verses from those Psalms. But it's believed that here towards the end of the Passover, he would have been singing with his disciples Psalm 118. And if that is true, it's very profound, the very words that he would have been singing with his disciples there as they were going to the Mount of Olives, to the place of distress, to the place of betrayal. In verse 5 of Psalm 118, it says, "From my distress I called upon the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me in a large place. The Lord is for me, I will not fear. What can man do to me?" Imagine what Jesus is thinking as he's singing these words. "The Lord is for me among those who help me. Therefore I will look with satisfaction on those who hate me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man." If anybody knew that, it was Jesus. It's better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. And then further on, perhaps Jesus was thinking of these words. "The stone which the builders rejected," verse 22, "has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." Jesus was about to enter into rejection. Betrayal first, yes, but rejection. The religious leaders, the political leaders were all going to reject him. But this song would have reminded Jesus at that point that, yes, they're going to reject me, but I'm going to become the chief cornerstone. And upon the thing that I am about to do, God will build his church. And the living stones that will be aligned to me, connected to me, will be built up into a spiritual house to offer up sacrifices of praises to God, as Peter would later speak about. So, yes, they were singing a hymn, but it was a profound hymn and one that would have connected Jesus to what he was about to undergo. And I would suggest that in the time of our distress and our difficulty and hardships, when we know that Gethsemane is around the corner, sing a hymn. Sing a hymn that will remind you that my true trust should be in the Lord, not in man, not in my own abilities or capabilities, not in my own ingenuity, but in God who can help me. The Lord who will set me in a large place. The Lord is the one who I take refuge in. He says they went out to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives would have been east of Jerusalem. And it was a place where Jesus would commonly go. And it was a place of prayer. And here it takes on a whole nother flavor, a whole nother light. Here it was a place where really there were a lot of olive trees, as you would think. And we typically, well, I'll get to that in a minute, but it's basically the Mount of Olives. It's a place that they would go. And now what's interesting is, to get to the Mount of Olives, they had to pass through the Kidron Valley to get to this mount, which is the exact route that David took when he was betrayed. When his son Absalom was coming against him, and he learned about it, and he knew that Absalom had won basically all of Israel over to him, and David said, we got to get out of here. And they went down this valley of Kidron just weeping and crying and lamenting over what was going on. And it was a place of true sorrow. Even Ahithophel, one of David's close, companions, betrayed him. And we talked about that last week, which David would later write about in Psalm 55 when he talks about the one that he had trusted, his own friend, had betrayed him. But nonetheless, this is the same pathway that David took when Absalom was taking over the city. And here Jesus is going there, again in distress and mental agony. In verse 27 it says, and Jesus said to them, you will all fall away, because it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. So Jesus knows what's about to occur. He knows even those who followed him, who were close to him, would have walked through the rain with him, the heat of the summer with them, spent the night perhaps out in the brush with them. The ones who spent every waking moment with Christ, and every sleeping moment for that matter, at the most crucial moment would betray him. And that perhaps is the hardest thing to process. When you know that what I'm about to undertake is going to be difficult, it's going to be hard, and to realize that even my most closest companions and friends are one's going to betray me, the others are going to leave me. But Jesus knew the reality of the situation. Not so much so for the disciples. In verse 29, but Peter said to him, even though all may fall away, yet I will not. And I submit to you that that was the beginning of Peter's fall. The reason why he did deny Christ, or probably a good reason why he denied Christ later on, was because of this attitude. What does 1 Corinthians 10:12 teach us? That anyone who thinks he stands, take heed, else he will fall. That is, when in our pride and our self-sufficiency and we think, oh, we're so devoted to the Lord, I'll never fall away from the Lord. Better look out. That might be a key indicator that you're headed that direction. We just don't know, and we always have to keep a humble disposition before the Lord to realize that we are all susceptible to betraying Christ in one way or the other. But verse 30, Jesus said to him, truly I say to you that this very night, before a rooster crows twice, you yourself will deny me 3 times. So Mark's the only one that tells us before the rooster crows twice. The other places tell us just before the rooster crows. So this just gives us a little bit more detail. The rooster crowed, he crowed twice. But nonetheless, he says, before that happens, you'll deny me not only once, you're not going to deny me twice, but 3 times. And that would be complete and thorough testimony against Peter of his betrayal. In Jewish custom, 2, 3, those were the numbers of witness. Whenever you want to witness someone, you always had to have 2 or 3 witnesses to confirm anything in court. And him denying 3 times would just further confirm that he was not really as committed to Christ as he put on. In verse 31, but Peter kept saying insistently, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they were all saying the same thing also. Peter was the type that, I just marvel at Peter because there was times when Jesus would say something and Peter would just say, no, it's not going to happen like that. Remember when Jesus was talking about, Peter had made that great confession, you are the Christ, and Jesus said, yeah, that, flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but the Father. He said, on this rock I will build my church, and good pat on the back. And then Jesus starts to talk about what it means to be the Christ, that he was going to have to suffer, that he was going to die, and then be raised on the 3rd day. And what does Peter say? Permit it not to be so. It can't be this way. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. For you're not interested in God's things, you're interested in man's. Well, here Peter's kind of doing the same thing. Jesus says, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows twice. And Peter says, no, it's not going to happen. How many times do we listen to the words of Christ or the words of scriptures and we say, no, it can't be like that. It couldn't happen like that. Just believe. Take it for what it says. And not only Peter, but he says all were saying the same thing also. It's interesting, and I was kind of mulling this over in my head. Earlier in the story, in Mark chapter 14, when Jesus said that one of them would betray him, they were all saying, is it I? As though they had some doubt, as though they felt as though they could be the one that betrayed him. Maybe they were, but now they're very confident that not only would they not betray him, they wouldn't even deny him. What has changed? Well, it doesn't tell us. That's the simple answer. But could it have something to do with the fact that now Judas is gone out of the picture? And he's already been designated as the one that would betray him. And maybe that puffed him up a little bit. Who knows? But sometimes that does happen with us, does it not? When we see other people fall, when we see other people do things that are, just horrible or against God's will, or they fall to the side. If we're not really careful, what could that do? I would never do that. We could get prideful and puffed up. Something we have to guard against. But whatever the reason, now they seem to be overly confident. And then we get to verse 32. Now, the Mount of Olives is a more general location. Now, the Garden of Gethsemane. It says, they came to a place called Gethsemane, which means oil press. If you just take the Hebrew word there, it just means the oil press. And it's believed that this was a place where, of course, on the Mount of Olives, you got olive trees. And if you take the olives, it would be nice and convenient to have somewhere close by where you can press the olives, so you don't have to carry them as far. And it's believed because of the name Gethsemane that this would be a place where they would press down the olives and get the olive oil, right? Very, I don't want to use the word ironic, but very convenient, or I think significant, that this would be the place where Jesus himself would be pressed, where he would be distressed and pushed down. This is a time when his soul would be stressed down into anguish and burdened, pressed. This is where Jesus was going to go. And it's not really, some people make assertions as to where the exact location of the Garden of Gethsemane, but we're really not sure. It could have been, in all likelihood, it was west of the Mount of Olives. Some think it was right by the bridge that goes over the Kidron Valley, or the Kidron River there. But wherever it was a place, of course, where they would have pressed out this oil. And again, this is a place where we oftentimes must enter as Christians. The place where we are pressed down, where circumstances, hardship, depression, anxiety, loss, you name it, persecution, rejection, these things come upon our souls and just press us down like an oil press, and just press down and weigh on us, and weigh on us, and weigh on us, and weigh on us. And what we're going to find with Jesus here is, of course, as you would expect from Jesus, a tremendous example of what to do when we enter into our quote-unquote Gethsemane. Isn't it nice to have some guidance when we enter into Gethsemane? May not make it too much easier as far as what we're feeling and the emotions connected to it, but at least we have some way of navigating, some compass that we can use to kind of help us find some direction. And Jesus gives us some direction here. And one thing that he does is he brings people with him. He says to them here in verse 32, and he said to the disciples, "Sit here until I have prayed." So this would have been originally the 11. He's going to take 3 more further in. So really 8 of them stayed at this point. But he brought people with him. And that's important for us whenever we enter into our Gethsemane. Bring people with you. You know, usually when you're pressed down and distressed and anxious, or whatever the emotional turmoil that you have, whatever it might be, one thing we tend to do or can do is alienate ourselves from others. Bring other people with you into that distress. Recognize that you know, alienating yourself, being alone in your hardship and the distress that you're feeling is just going to make it that much more worse. Bring people along. And sometimes all that they can do for you is just sit and pray. And to recognize that. Don't bring them along because you think they're going to solve your problem or that they're going to whisk away your emotional state. Of course not. Don't ever put that burden on anybody when you're distressed. No one can do that for you. But what they can do for you is be there and be present and sit and pray. That in and of itself is important. But in verse 33, and he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be very distressed and troubled. So this is the 3rd time he's taken Peter, James, and John, separated from the rest of the apostles. We saw it when he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. We saw it at the Mount of Transfiguration, and now we see it here. These were the guys who needed to witness these particular things about Christ. They needed to see Christ in the power of resurrection. They needed to see Christ in the glory of heaven. And now they need to see Christ in his struggle and his hardship. They needed to witness all of that. These would be the pillars of the church. These would be the ones that would carry through and bring about, of course, the testimony of what Christ had done to the ends of the earth. But then look what he does in verse 34. And he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch. Oh, by the way, before we do that verse, there is one more thing I want to say about verse 33. Where it says, and began to be very distressed, the New American Standard says. And the King James, it says he was sore amazed. And that's a little bit closer to the Greek, because it wasn't just that he became distressed. It was almost like he was shocked, like he was amazed at just how difficult this was, just how distressed he really was. If you go to the original Greek, it's actually there, which I think perhaps you can relate to, right? Haven't there been times when you had to go through something and you knew it was coming, but then when it came there, it's like, wow, I didn't know it was going to be this tough. Speaking of Mother's Day, maybe some of the mothers, you think about having children, oh yeah, it's going to be painful going through childbirth. But then you actually get there and you're like, whoa, you're amazed at just how difficult it is. That could be something that Jesus is experiencing here in his humanity. He's just sore amazed. He's like, oh, or maybe it's more like just being startled at how difficult it was. Sometimes that will happen to us as well in our distress. But then he turns to his disciples and says, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch. Verse 34. Now this is another thing that Jesus does. One, he takes people along with him. But two, he allows himself to be vulnerable. He tells them what he's going through. He expresses what he's feeling. My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. The King of glory, the one who later would be called the King of kings and Lord of lords, the one that in John chapter 1 we're told that all things were created through him, and nothing was created, nothing was made that wasn't made through him. This one who shared glory with the Father and was enjoyed all the heavenly bliss, and will one day enjoy that, or one day from our story we'll go back into that glory again. Here he's in a place of vulnerability, and he opens up his heart to others to express how he's feeling. And that can sometimes be the hardest thing about going through a hardship, being vulnerable to others. I think it's really hard for men to be vulnerable sometimes, or a lot of times, but it can be difficult for anybody to be able to say, hey, I'm really hurting here. I'm really struggling with this. My soul is grieved, even to the point of death, Jesus says. He's opening up to his disciples. Yes, he wants them to understand that he is the Messiah. He is the King. He is the one that later he will say, all authority has been given to me. But at this point, he was expressing his vulnerability, his distress. So that's two things we don't want to do when we are distressed, is push everybody away and get in our little corner and just kind of block ourselves off from everybody, and then clam up and not express how you're feeling. This is why in so many cases people commit suicide and everyone else is just like, how did this even happen? It's because the person didn't express what they were feeling. They didn't allow themselves to be vulnerable so that they could get the help that they needed. If you're going through this point, if you're going through Gethsemane, that's what the church is about. That's what family is about. That's what we're all about, to support one another, help each other in a time of struggle and difficulty. And then in verse 35 it says, and he went a little beyond them. This is also true when you're going through your own personal Gethsemane. You can take people with you, but understand that no one can ever go the full length with you. No matter how no matter how well-intentioned your friends are, no matter how supportive your church family is, whenever we're going through the pressing, the oil press, so to speak, of our souls and our hearts, just recognize that people can go with you only so far. There's a point in which we kind of do have to bear it on our own. And to be okay with that, to realize that other people are not the solution, that other people can help during that hard time, but also to take ownership of that hardship as well. And to be able to understand that people can only take you so far. And to understand that and not to become bitter towards them or things like that, but just to understand that people can go with you, but they can only go so far. Each of us experience hardship differently, and each of us have our own experience with it. We might have the same experience, but one person is dealing with it in a totally different way than another person. So it might be the case that you're surrounded with people who don't really understand what you're going through, or don't even really feel what you're feeling, but that's okay. They're still there, and they're still present. And he says he fell to the ground. This is verse 35 continuing. And fell to the ground. And in the original language, it has the idea of him constantly falling to the ground. Not just he fell to the ground once and started to pray, but just showing the emotional agony, the distress, the desperation that he had. He's just stumbling. He's falling down before his father, and he's praying to him. This is the situation that he's in. He says he began to pray that if it were possible, the hour might pass by. And he was saying, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. This, we talk about the model prayer, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The one from Matthew chapter 6. That is the model prayer. That's what Jesus gave us as kind of a model to follow in our prayer. But when we're in Gethsemane, I think this prayer by Jesus is our model prayer. He says, Abba, Father. And one person suggested that, in the original language, if you're reading the original text, you would notice something that we don't notice in the English. Abba, that would have been a Hebrew term, but Father would have been the Greek. So this person I read made a point, and perhaps it's valid, that here Jesus is expressing both in Hebrew and Greek his distress, which would later lead to the Jew first and also to the Greek receiving the benefits of Christ's suffering. But nonetheless, he's saying, Abba, Father. He recognizes God. Abba was, in Hebrew, it's like the tender word that a young son would say to his father, like Papa or Daddy, something like that, a very intimate word. But he also recognizes him as his Father as well, positionally. But he says, all things are possible for you. So this is the one thing that when we're praying to the Lord, when we're in Gethsemane to realize, is that when we come to him in prayer, that we are coming to a God in whom all things are possible. Maybe that's the first thing that we need to recognize. All things are possible with God. If we come to him in our distress and we just come to him saying, well, I'm just going to throw this prayer up because I've been taught that that's what I'm supposed to do, we're probably not going to get much encouragement from that prayer. But when we come to God and saying, Lord, you created it all. You painted the sky with clouds. You brought about these massive stars in the heavens. You set the sun and the moon in their courses. You filled this earth with habitation and vegetation and rivers of flowing water. You've done all things well in your creation. You are all powerful. You sit on heaven. Earth is your footstool. You are all powerful, almighty. And we understand that he is all powerful and can do all things. Then we're coming to a God that we know can help us. Will he help us in the way maybe that we have imagined in our heads? Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment. But we know that we have a God that we're praying to who makes everything possible. And then the second thing we do is pray about what you're going through. Remove this cup from me. Be honest with God. Recognize he can do all things, and then just clearly state what you want him to do. Lord, take this anxiety away. Take this fear away. Take this sorrow from my heart. Lord, give me balm for my soul, for my spirit, to bring healing. Be very specific about what you want him to do for you. Throw it out there. He is the God who can do all things. Why wouldn't you bring your problems to him? Lord, help me deal with this difficult personality that I have to deal with day in and day out. Or, help me with my finances. Help me with my health. whatever it is, just plainly state to the Lord, the one who is your Father, the one in whom all things are possible, submit it to him. Which then brings us to the third thing that he prayed, yet not what I will, but what you will. Ultimately leaving it to the hands of the Father. Not as I will, but as you will. There is a certain peace to that statement. Some people say, well, that's just kind of selling out, saying, well, God can help you, he can do anything, but if you quantify it or qualify it with this statement, your will be done, then then it's just left up to him to do it anyways. Well, really that statement does more for you than it does for God, right? Because what it does is it brings peace to your soul. Oftentimes what agitates our distress and agitates our anxiety, agitates our fear, is when we're trying to hold on to control. When we're saying, I've got to control this situation. I want this situation to work out this way. I want these people to act in that way. And I want everything around me to flow fluently in this direction. And we have in our heads how we want it to be, and we're holding on to that, and we're just trying to control everything, and that just irritates the emotional turmoil in our hearts. But boy, what peace comes when we just say, Lord, your will be done. When we are able to just rest in him, cast all of our anxiety on him, knowing that he cares for us, and saying, Lord, as Romans 8:28 teaches us, that you will cause all things to work together for good for those who love you. Lord, I want you to fix this. I pray that this anxiety, this fear, this hardship would be taken away from me, removed from me, that this cup would pass from me, Lord. But in the end, you are a good God, and I trust you. I love you, I'm devoted to you, and I trust you in this particular situation. When we do that, there's a peace that can come into our hearts. Because we're no longer fighting and struggling against the circumstances. We just let it go and let it go to him. So this is a great model prayer. We recognize him as our Father. We recognize him as the one who can do all things, that all things are possible. We specifically mention what we need from him. And then lastly, we ultimately give it over to him and submit to his will. In verse 37, and he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So in all the while, see the contrast here between what Jesus is expressing towards the Father and what he's recognizing with his friends? He's realizing with his Father, all things are possible. But with his friends, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Always hold those two things together in your mind. When you come to the Father, you're coming to one in whom all things are possible. But if we're looking to our friends and our companions and our family, just recognize that they might have good intentions towards you. Their spirit might be willing to go the full distance with you, but in the end, the flesh is weak. Again, we go back to this thing that don't put too much expectation on others. Bring them alongside of you. They can be there just to be present with you and to help you in that way, but don't expect them to be able to fix the problem for you. And it might be because of their own mental exhaustion and what they call secondary trauma and all this stuff. They may not be able to go the full distance. They want to help you, but they just don't have the tools or the means to do it. Just recognize that, but still appreciate the fact that they are at least attempting to help you. Then verse 39, again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know how to answer him. Now we get something else. Don't just pray once, continue to pray. Go back time and time again to your Father. He is your refuge. He is your hiding place. Under the shadow of his wings, you'll find protection. As you submit to him, you'll find greater peace. Keep coming back to the Father time and time again. In verse 41, and he came a third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. So now we come to the last part of this section. And that's where you come to acceptance. You just accept the situation. You either enter into Gethsemane, or you know Gethsemane is coming. You bring other people alongside with you. You recognize the fact that they can't really go all the way with you, but you have them there to pray and to just sit and pray and be there with you. You're praying to the Father, recognizing He can do all things. All these things we talked about. But in the end, I think it comes down to really saying, okay, at some point you got to recognize this is the card I'm dealt, and I have to deal with it. Jesus says, after praying, let this cup pass, let this cup pass, let this cup pass 3 times, He saw the cup coming, and He accepted it. Hey, you want to sleep? Keep on sleeping, because the answer has already come. This is my lot. This is the cup I must drink. And now He's come to accept that cup. And that's a big jump for us emotionally, spiritually, when we realize, okay, this is what the Lord has laid out for me. And I readily accept it. And I enter into it boldly. And in verse 43, immediately while He was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who were from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. So He's saying, get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays is at hand, and here they are. They're coming in. As He is still speaking, this crowd is rushing in to take Him in. And it's a mob, really is what it is. Judas is there. He's got this mob. They got swords. They got clubs. Picture maybe scenes you see in the movies where they got torches and they're coming, up against this person. That's kind of what's happening here. And it says in verse 44, now when he who was betraying Him had given them a signal, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard. So this would have been a common greeting from a disciple to the rabbi that they were, learning under. So if he would go and kiss him, that was indicator that this is my rabbi. This is the one that I've told you about. He's the one that you should seize. And so, this is what makes the betrayal by Judas all the worse. It's not that, he had a weak moment. It's not that, they were pressing in on him and he gave in to the pressure that they were putting on him, and then, so he betrayed Jesus. This was premeditated. This was Judas planning ahead how he would betray Jesus. Even gave them a signal of how they would know exactly who it was that was Jesus, so that he could betray him all the better. It's a horrible way of betraying. But in verse 45, after coming, Judas immediately went to him saying, Rabbi, and kissed him. Betrayed with a kiss. How many times have people been betrayed with a kiss? We have to recognize that, there's people out there in the world who are really quick to kiss you, so to speak. They're real quick to butter you up, to make you feel as though they think well of you, but all the while they got the knife behind their back, ready to betray you. Not to promote cynicism or anything like that, but it just recognize the fact that does happen sometimes. And we just got to be open to it. Christ went through it Himself. In verse 46, they laid hands on Him and seized Him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now we find from the Gospel of John that this servant was Malchus. John apparently had some type of connections with the temple and with that area. And so this was probably someone that John knew personally. That's why he's the only one who mentions him by name. But basically, and we find also from the other gospel that this was Peter. So Peter takes out a sword and strikes at this guy, Malchus, and cuts off his ear. Luke, the Gospel of Luke, that's the only one, which is interesting because Luke was a physician. He's the only one that mentions that Christ actually came and healed his ear and brought it back. But this is what happened. And this shows the attitude of the disciples. The disciples thought, hey, this is a battle. This is physical warfare we're engaging in. Let's defend Jesus. And he says in verse 48, and Jesus said to him, or to them, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But this has taken to fulfill the scriptures. And they all left him and fled. So he again is showing really the cowardice of these people who, here he's teaching openly in the daylight, in the temple, but because they were afraid of the crowds, they wouldn't come and take him. Now they're sneaking in. They got this plan with Judas. It's nighttime. In the hidden darkness, then they come, and now they want to take him away. And they're trying to take him by force. And he says, look, what you're doing, you think you're being smooth, you think you're being conniving, this is all according to the scriptures. This was all foreordained. God is really in control. You guys think that because you have clubs and swords and these things that you're in control. God is really in control and has already planned this out. In verse 50 it says, and they all left him and fled. So here we see the disciples just taking off. While there was still a glimmer of hope, when they thought that, hey, maybe this is a battle that we have to engage in, they were willing to take up the sword and fight. But once Jesus heals Malchus, once they see that this is something different that is happening, once they see that Jesus is being bound and taken away, then they all flee. And they all escape. And that's something that Jesus would have, that would have really, tugged on Jesus' heart a lot. That, here I am. When you think that I'm the king, when you think that you might be my right-hand man, when you think that you will sit with me in the glory and the kingdom, yeah, you're sticking with me. Yeah, you'll fight. But when I'm bound, when I'm being taken away, when you see your Messiah bound with chains and with ropes, now you don't want to. Have you ever had a friend that was like that? Whenever you were doing well, when you were successful, when things were going well for you in your life, they were right there with you. Boy, they were really good friends. But then when things got difficult, maybe things with your marriage or your finances, then you look around and say, where did they go? Fair-weathered friends is what we call them. And that's kind of what's happening here. Jesus knows what that feels like. So if you've ever gone through that, just recognize that Jesus knows what that feels like. It says in verse 51, a young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him. But he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. So some think that might have been Mark himself, and that's why he's not mentioned by name. But this is basically just shown to demonstrate just how desperate they were to flee from Jesus. It wasn't just that, Jesus is being bound, so, we can't really do anything about it, so let's just leave. Like, they're really trying to get out of there, so much so that this guy who had nothing on him, really nothing on him but this linen sheet, he would escape. Even though they tried to grab him, he still kept on fighting against them until he ran away naked. He was desperate to get away from there. And sometimes maybe that's how we feel when we get into a Garden of Gethsemane situation. That it's not that we just fall away or that we stumble a little bit in our faith, but we're desperate to get out of there. We don't want to have any more to do with Jesus. It's too difficult following Jesus. This isn't the Jesus I thought I was following, and we just want to get out of there. So much so that we'll even, here, just take my linen sheet, take whatever you want, but I'm out of here. I'm packing up camp and I'm leaving. Well, let's not be like that. Just to put it plainly, we don't need to be fair-weathered friends with Jesus. We need to be the type of people who say, Lord, I'll be with you in Bethany. I'll be there with you in the upper room. And yes, Lord, I'll be with you in Gethsemane. Even when all of my expectations about you fail. Even when everything that I dreamed would come true in my connection, in my relationship with you, when it all dissolves, Lord, I'm still going to hold on to you. And I'm not going to flee. Why? Not because I'm in a relationship with you for what I can get out of it, because I think you're going to give me all this stuff or that I'm going to have this high position, but just because of the essence of who you are. Because you are wonderful, because you are great and glorious, I hold fast to you because of who you are. Not what you can give me, but because of who you are. And any relationship that you have, where that's the attitude, is going to be a relationship that flourishes. You have a husband who just loves his wife or is nice to his wife and does things for his wife for what he can get out of her, or vice versa. The wife just kind of goes along with the husband because, he pays the bills or whatever, whatever the case may be. Or a friend, because a friend is maybe wealthy and you get all the fringe benefits of being friends with them. Really true friendship, relationship, love comes from a love that is derived or is focused on the person themselves. Because I love that person. Not everything around them, not everything connected to them, not all the little benefits I get from being with them, but just because I love the person themselves. Because I see their heart, I see them as a person, I value them as a person, and I love them because of who they are. Boy, that's a substantial relationship, right? That's the one that will make it through the good times and the bad times. The same thing is true with Christ. Love him for who he is, not for what he can give you. Is it wonderful that he blesses us? Is it wonderful that Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 3 says he's blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places? Absolutely. That's a great thing. But the true thing is who he is in himself. That's what we should be striving after. That's what we're longing for, to be near to him. To love him because he's love-worthy. And he deserves our love and our commitment. So that ends our study this morning. I don't know if you're in the midst of a Gethsemane experience right now, but like I mentioned before, no matter how, if we live long enough, eventually we're going to be there. Eventually we're going to be in Gethsemane. Whether it's because of persecution or some other situation, we're going to be with the Lord there. We can follow his example. We can follow his example and also follow him and be committed to him and show that we are committed to him even through the struggle and the trial because he is worthy. But if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, maybe this whole idea of Gethsemane, it can actually be hard to follow Jesus. You mean if I follow Jesus that life isn't just going to be a bed of roses the rest of my life? I might actually have to struggle? Hey, just recognize the fact that he's worth it. He's worth the hardship. He's worth the difficulty, the struggle. And yes, one day you will get the fringe benefits of being in relationship with him. Yes, one day you will be in a position of honor and in a position of bliss and joy where there's no sickness or crying or death or mourning. There will be a day when all is restored, when all is redeemed. No more death. But until that day, we hold on to Christ because he's going to take us there.